In the year 2000, which is not that long ago, 256 megabytes of memory would set you back almost $1,000. In today's money, that's around $1,600. A hard disk would be much more affordable, but still pricey enough for its size. Just 75 gigabytes would cost around $500. Nowadays, with $2,500, we can get a whole lot more than just memory and hard drive space. This kind of money is good enough to buy a whole computer. If you're a Mac user, it might be a baseline model, but still, it's a complete setup. And not only that, but it also has 64 times more memory and 7 times more disk space than a computer of the early aughts. Of course, that's to be expected. It's the unstoppable nature of technological progress at play. Every few years, the jumps in power are so great, it makes the older tech feel laughable in comparison. But this abundance of resources also has its downsides. Since there's so much memory and storage to go around, developers get a little bit lazy, and as a result we get bloated applications that require a lot more resources, wasting quite a bit of RAM and disk space. Let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna preface this by saying that no one's heavily affected by this issue. Most of us do have a lot of RAM and terabytes upon terabytes of hard disk space. But I still think we should shine some light on this because if it goes unchecked, things could get out of hand. Let's take as an example Adobe's Creative Suite. I've just restarted my machine, so there's nothing really running in the background. It's just the Finder and the Activity Monitor. Now let's go to the Memory tab and let's find all the Adobe processes that run in the background. It's a bit tricky to find them all because they run under different names, but I think I have most of them down. Let's first check the ones that have Adobe's name. These already use 580 megabytes of RAM. I bet you did not expect that. There are also some other ones under Creative Cloud, and these ones use almost 100 megabytes of memory. But wait, there's more. Under CC we have 120 megabytes more. And finally, under Core Sync, there's 30 megabytes. So in total, all these processes use 824 megabytes of RAM. That's without loading any application like Photoshop or Illustrator. All they do is check for the user's credentials, application updates, and other small tasks like these. That feels like an insane amount of memory for these basic tasks. And that's from a freshly restarted system. Usually, after the computer is on for a while, there are a couple extra rogue processes using more memory. So not only a ton of memory is spent on a simple installer app, but resources are also not freed up when needed. Is it the end of the world that these processes use up this much memory? No, not really. My computer has 64 gigabytes of memory, so I still have 63 gigabytes left. And on top of that, the operating system is good enough to retrieve memory if needed. But at the same time, it feels incredibly wasteful. I'm no programmer, but shouldn't these tasks run a little bit more efficiently? And I can already hear your thoughts. It's just Adobe doing Adobe things, but that's not really true. There's a ton of other applications doing the same thing. Let's search, for example, for Dropbox. Dropbox's only task is to keep files on certain folders synced up. But as you can see, Dropbox is using quite a bit of memory as well. If we add up all these processes, Dropbox needs around 400 megabytes to run. That's a whole lot of memory for such a small and basic utility. Synology's file client is a little bit more lightweight compared to Dropbox. It just needs 80 megabytes to run, but if the system is on for more than just a few minutes, these processes start adding up as well. This is how the Activity Monitor looked like right before restarting. And in some cases, this list was even longer than this one. In general, this type of app installers are usually quite wasteful when it comes to resources. Let's take as an example the M installer. It comes from a company that develops plugins for Final Cut Pro. M installer's only purpose is to check the user's credentials and to easily download plugins you might have purchased. This thing takes 112 megabytes of memory. And as you can see, now that I've opened it up, it uses even more memory. If the system runs for a while, the memory requirement increases even more. Here's a screenshot of the installer using 260 megabytes, even though I haven't used Final Cut or opened up the app. So there's something going on there as well. I have more of these installers on my system, but even with these 4 examples, you can already see that 1.4 gigabytes of memory is gone. My assumption is that these installers are built with some third-party tools that are not optimized in any way. The priority of these tools is building cross-compatible solutions, but how they're built is less of a priority. They certainly do the job, but in the process there's a ton of waste when it comes to resources. Not to mention the gazillion processes that constantly run in the background. I do understand that using these ready-made solutions frees up developers' time to work on other more important features, but at the same time, resources should be used in a more economical way. Things are even worse when it comes to disk space. We thankfully live in an era where storage is relatively cheap, so again we have room to spare, at least when it comes to regular hard disks. SSDs are still on the expensive side. But once more, this abundance of storage leads to inefficiencies. For example, both macOS and Windows install a ton of extra things most users will never use, like extra languages, drivers, extensions, and all sorts of helpers. I've lost count of how many times friends and family complained about running low on disk space, and my go-to solution was always to go through the system and delete all these unnecessary files. Are these things useful to have? Of course, but given the fact that most people don't need 90% of them, there should be some hand-holding from the OS's side. A couple of questions asking whether they need X or Y could somewhat solve the issue. In some cases that's being done already, but it needs to happen in a more extensive way. Another example is Unreal Engine. With multiple versions installed, you can easily end up using hundreds of gigabytes of space. But if, for example, you're not doing game development, you can save up more than 20 gigabytes of data per installation just by disabling some platform-specific tools. There are ways to disable them easily, but even tech-savvy people are afraid that they might break something, so they end up leaving all this data on their disk. And then there's the whole caching debacle. A lot of applications fail at clearing up caches. I've had this with a ton of apps. There were several occasions where I had to dig deep into an applications folder just to delete what the program should have done on its own. Apple's podcast app is one of the worst offenders. You can easily end up with gigabytes upon gigabytes of wasted space if you're not careful. After Effects is another one of these applications. A few months ago, I had to clear up more than 200 gigabytes of caches from a project I worked on 2 or so years ago. That is crazy. After Effects should have done this on its own. I had a similar experience a few weeks ago with ZBrush. There were 25 gigabytes of caches from crashes and other saved states. The total size wasn't as extreme as After Effects, but it's still a considerable amount. And it's not just these applications, there are several more that fail to correctly clear up old caches. It could be small amounts, but they quickly add up. In my case, just from these 3 programs alone, I saved up more than 240 gigabytes. That's a lot of space reserved for useless data. So, what is the solution for all these things? Should developers spend hours upon hours optimizing memory and storage requirements? Probably not, and since I'm not a developer, I don't know what these optimizations mean time-wise. But as always, there needs to be some balance. I think some development time should be spent in order to build slightly more efficient systems. For sure, we can afford to waste some memory and storage resources, especially if that means that development time could be spent on other, more important features. But constantly tying up memory and CPU resources for an installer feels very wasteful. And the same goes for caches. I'm not saying to get rid of caching, but building a smarter system that deletes them after a set time or even asking for the user's input will help a ton. So overall, I think there are some easy fixes that will solve 90% of these resource wasteful issues. Just because we have a ton of resources, it doesn't mean we should start building inefficient apps. But yeah, that's where my head's at currently. What do you guys think? Have you experienced this issue yourself? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I'm also interested to hear a developer's perspective about all this. So if there's a developer in my audience, do let us know what you think in the comments below. And that's about it for this video. It was a bit of a tangent, but it was something that's been bugging me for quite a while. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one.